Happy Sunday, everybody. My name is Mike Sheehy, and I'm from unknowntech.io. And I'm going to walk you through the deployment of Nutanix Kubernetes platform on the Nutanix Cloud Infrastructure. So first and foremost, let's set up the environment to give you an overview of what we're looking at. Then we'll talk about the prereqs, how to get your jump box, your bastion updated and get ready to deploy NKP. Then we'll actually deploy it and walk through some application deployments, additional cluster services, etc. And as we move through the series, we'll do more advanced videos and technical demos on what we're talking about here. So let's look to the right here. You can see I have two windows open in this one window. One to the left, I have Visual Studio Code, and I am SSH into a jump box, which actually is running this jump box here. You can see jump box. I know original names, right? But this jump box is running on a cluster called USECN. This is my cloud native cluster. This is solely dedicated to Kubernetes and cloud native automation, cloud native workloads, especially around NKP and OpenShift. But today we're really focused on Nutanix Kubernetes platform. This cluster, just to give you an idea of what it represents from a hardware perspective, is a pretty beefy single node cluster that has basically local disk protection. So I have a 64 core AMD CPU, half a terabyte of memory, and roughly six plus terabytes or tebibytes, of NVMe storage that is mirrored internally to the system. So there is some local resiliency there. Again, this is not common from a production deployment. We do support 1, 2 node, 3 node, and more cluster types for specific use cases. But generally speaking, you'll be deploying to more than likely a 3 node solution or at least a 2 node solution for high availability from an infrastructure perspective. So when I say it's not as common, it's typically reserved for edge and robo use cases. All right, so now that you have an idea of the landscape from an infrastructure perspective, again, just going back to my workstation that we're watching here, I have Visual Studio Code in the left window here, and in the right window I have Prism Central and a couple other things which we'll talk about in a minute. The first thing we need to do is set up a jump box, and that jump box is going to basically run the NKP software, right? As well as some other things, and as well as become the initial bootstrap mechanism to actually bootstrap the NKP management cluster. And what happens during the bootstrap process is we load a CAPI provider for Nutanix on top of that container running in your container runtime. In my case, I chose Docker. We'll talk about that here in a few minutes, but you could use Podman or another container runtime. But what we're doing here is, again, we're basically standing up a bootstrap container, right, that runs the CAPI component. So now I can target Nutanix from an infrastructure perspective. And then upon completion, we hand off the CAPI component onto the Nutanix Kubernetes platform infrastructure running on Nutanix. And I'll show you what that looks like in a few minutes. But generally speaking, that's what we're doing. From a prereq perspective, before we get into the actual Nutanix Kubernetes platform software, and from now on I'm going to refer to it as NKP because it's much easier for me to say that. But from an NKP software perspective, before we even get into that, there are specific prereqs that you need to have loaded up on the jump box. So for example, you need to have kubectl. So I have kubectl. I believe it's a newer version than the version that we support for Kubernetes itself, which is fine. You can see here I'm running 1.31.1. In the most recent release of NKP 2.1.2.1, I believe we support Kubernetes version 1.29.6. It might be .7. I could be wrong. We have to double check on that. But the reality is I have a newer version of kubectl. Generally speaking, you want the same or newer version of the Kubernetes solution you're going to be managing. Next thing you need is Helm, of course, and Helm will be installing some of the components for NKP. So let's make sure that you have Helm installed. And here I have, I think, 3.16.2. When I installed this, that was the latest version. That was, I think, last week when I did this. So I'm using the latest version of Helm. Another thing that we have to have installed here, or set up at least, is an SSH key, right? So I do have an SSH key. And you can see here that I have this ID, this public key here associated with my private key, and this is the SSH key that I created to leverage for my SSH connectivity to my Kubernetes nodes that I'll be deploying, which are just VMs running in on Nutanix. So, essentially, you need an SSH key. Of course, NKP requires an SSH key too to do things on those hosts via a secure means through SSH. So, again, you need an SSH key as well. Another thing that you should have, not a prereq, but I say should because in most cases you will, and in production you certainly will have this, and that's a local registry, right? Or a registry that's hosted somewhere that you have control over. Maybe it's Azure Container Registry like ACR, or it's Elastic Container Registry, right? ECR with AWS. But for an on-prem solution, I use Harbor, right? So you can see here I have a Harbor registry set up. This is actually running on my other cluster, US East Core. For now, really it should be running on this box, but for now I leave it on another cluster that I have access or accessibility to. And of course, there is specific settings for Harbor that you need to configure, and you actually need to create an access certificate as well for your Kubernetes cluster to be able to authenticate and connect and authenticate back to your Docker registry or your local registry. So in this case, I have a project stood up called docker.io, and I'm using that as a proxy cache. So basically what I'm doing is I'm pulling the images from a publicly available registry, right, for NKP, including some of my applications, which when we get into the application stuff. And then what I do is I mirror those images. When I pull them down, I mirror them back onto my image registry, my mirror registry, which is set up for Docker.io. I can also use this as a normal registry too. It doesn't have to be a mirror registry, but I could also set this up as my basic registry, my formal direct access registry as well. And in your case, more than likely in your enterprise environment, you will have a registry that does obviously has access direct because you're coding and you're pushing images to your local repository or local registry. And you will also have something available for an image registry cache. This is especially nice to have, or really should be required for an air-gapped environment as well, where you are able to download or at least obtain the images and upload those images to the registry or an image registry. But again, I have a cert authentication cert called server.crt, which I'll point to during the deployment of the NKP control plane and management cluster. So the next thing we need to do after we have this all installed on the jump box is to actually go into Nutanix support into the portal. So portal.nutanix.com. You'll log in with your portal credentials, and you'll go to downloads, right under the support page, and you'll see NKP or Nutanix Kubernetes platform, and that's what you'll click on. The latest release as of this video is version 2.1.2.1. One thing I want to point out is that, NKP is not a new product, okay? It's new from a name perspective, and now it's part of the Nutanix overall platform. But it was part of it. It was actually an acquisition from a company called Day2IQ, formerly Mesosphere. And Day2IQ had many customers, and they were already down the road with this product at other customers, right, in production. So this is not a 1.0 product. Think of it think of it as a mature platform that basically Nutanix has acquired, and we have now integrated it into our stack from a platform perspective. I'm going to show you what that looks like. As a matter of fact, as you actually read the blog before you got to this video, hopefully you did, you'll see how we're going about delivering NKP to our customers. In my environment, I'm running Linux. You may be running Mac OS, so I'm running Rocky Linux in my jump box. You can you can run Ubuntu. You can run any Linux flavor you'd like, as long as it's aligned to, either a Red Hat release, right, or version, or an Ubuntu type, release, right. So again, I personally like Ubuntu, but sometimes I use Rocky because eventually we're going to have Red Hat support for on-prem NKP, and we'll talk about base images. Matter of fact, let's talk about it now. So for Nutanix as the target, we support two image types, right? One is an image type that we provide. As a matter of fact, not just the NKP package, you also need to download, if you plan on using this, the NKP Node OS image that we provide for you, which we update, provide, We try to slim it down, provide you a slim OS. Now it's not as slim as like say Flatcar Linux, and we do support Flatcar on other substrates. Hopefully we'll bring some of those things, and I think there's a roadmap to bring some of those things into Nutanix from a substrate perspective. So we support Rocky Linux, right, from a Node OS image perspective that we provide, or you can build your own image on Rocky or Ubuntu 22.04, right? So you have the capability of doing that. There are differences in capabilities between the two from what we support. So for example, if you require GPU support on Nutanix, you'll be forced to use Ubuntu 22.04 today. And then roadmap certainly will be bringing in Red Hat and other distros as well. Hopefully Flatcar from a minimalization perspective, because I know a lot of customers are looking at minimizing their security footprint from that perspective. So again, that's what we support today from a Node OS perspective on Nutanix. There is many other Node OSs that we support, including Red Hat, Flatcar, etc., on other substrates like AWS, Azure as an example, VMware as an example. So again, I'm showing you NKP how it's supported on Nutanix today, but we also support other non-Nutanix and pre-provisioned infrastructure. So for instance, VMware, you can target VMware as an example on 3-tier platform, which is not even Nutanix from an infrastructure perspective. You could target public cloud, both dedicate is both a direct public cloud NKP cluster using, let's for example, AWS EC2 instances and EBS block storage or EFS file storage, right? But we also support the ability to use managed Kubernetes as well, including EKS and AKS as well in the public cloud, and giving you that uniform approach, right? So we're giving you this uniformity in this unified cloud native platform, no matter what Kubernetes solution you're using and where you're running it. Okay, that's the value of NKP. I won't get into Convoy Image Builder yet. We'll talk a little bit about that later. There is an image build process that's included with the NKP package that we can go through a little bit later when we actually build an Ubuntu image to use. But for now, we're going to just use the NKP Node OS image. Okay, so we have to download the NKP Node image and upload it to the image service in Prism Central. So we download this. I've already done this, so I'm not going to actually go through the process. I'm not actually going to go through the process of installing NKP, but basically you download the tar file, you untar the file, right? You extract the tar file, and then for the NKP executable, you actually point that to the user bin file, right? So now you can see that I have NKP. So NKP version, right, is version 2.12.1, which is the current version as of this video, effective October 21st, 2024. Again, let's go back to NKP Node OS image. I actually downloaded this already. We're going to go back into the image service under Prism Central. And you can see here I have this NKP Rocky 9.4 release. This is the image that I've uploaded into the image service so that when we use the CAPI, right, we call it CapX, right, for Nutanix, but the CAPI controller, right, what happens is we're calling the infrastructure and we're pointing to this image. And when we go through the TUI, which is basically the text-based user interface that I'm going to show you to deploy this, we're going to map those things, right, within the TUI. All right, so now that we have this up and ready, let's go back to VM view here. We have our registry, we have our jump box all ready to go. NKP create cluster Nutanix, and that launches the text-based user interface. And here we'll put in our information. So first we're going to put in the Prism Central endpoint, which is right here, okay, to the right. So https://10.0.60.150 port 9440, the username, password to log in. It is insecure, secure, yes. And now we're going to select the project. It was NKP. So before we do any of this, we have to actually go in. I should have said this before. My fault here. Let's go back to under the hamburger menu. We're going to choose the drop-down menu. We're going to choose Apps and Marketplace. And within this, you have projects to those projects. So I created one called NKP. Right? I actually added a user and a role, and I added what's called an account. So under infrastructure, I added the Nutanix local AZ account, which includes this cluster, US East Cloud Native or USDCN, and I choose my preferred VLAN that I want to leverage. And if I wanted to, I can actually put quotas in here if I wanted. So in order to do this, you have to deploy what's called a policy engine, which would, when you create the actual project itself, it gives you an option to actually deploy the policy engine virtual machine, which allows you to actually do quotas and other things, which we'll talk about later. But for now, it's really about quotas, but we're not going to put a quota on the cluster. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to disable the quota, right? And we're not going to save it since we didn't make any changes. But the reality here is now we have a project, and within that project, I have a cluster called USECN. Okay, so I go back to project, I go to CN, and within that, I want to choose server-IPAM. See how this matches? USECN for the cluster and server-IPAM for your IP address automation. The NKP cluster name is going to be easy for me. I'm going to just call it NKP management. And then we need to create an IP address that is for your API control plane endpoint. So basically, what we're doing here is we're basically providing an IP, and of course we're using 6443, which is the default port for the Kubernetes API, and that is going to be the target for the API endpoint. And I'm using this IP address, which is an IP address that is not sitting in the server IPAM DHCP pool, right? It's still in this VLAN, VLAN 10, but it's not part of that pool. So again, this is the same subnet, right? Overall subnet, but not part of the pool. Then we're going to select our image. You can see here I have a choice between Rocky and Ubuntu. We're going to choose Rocky. I'm going to talk about Ubuntu later, and we're going to walk through the process of creating that image and prepping that image to use for NKP. But for now, we're going to use the NodeOS image that I downloaded and uploaded into Prism Central. And now it's going to ask for the service load balancer IP range. So what I'm going to do is, again, use the same subnet, 10.0.10, and I'm going to go 211 through 10.0.10.214. For the pod network, since I already use 192.168 for other networks in my home, my lab network, I'm going to change this basically to 172.16/16, and then I'll keep the service network the same. For storage, okay, we automatically install a container storage interface for Nutanix block storage. And so what we're doing here is we're providing the policies, right, and the file systems, and whether it's hypervisor attached, and then choosing the storage container that is on that cluster. So the reclaim policy I'm going to do is going to be delete. So as when I delete a container or a Kubernetes cluster that has PVCs from these volumes, it's actually going to delete and not retain those PVCs. You can choose to retain those if you'd like, and you can choose a file system, right? So there's a reason why you would choose ext4 over XFS and vice versa. I won't get into details around that, but for now we're just going to keep it default at ext4. We're always going to use hypervisor attached volumes. This is the best way, because before, when we did our CSI, we actually did node-based or node-attached volumes, right? And what that did was we had customers come back and say, you know what, there's some security issues there where, we don't like the fact that, we're having to, the NodeOS is actually connecting, the nodes themselves are connecting back to your block storage through CSI. So you want to do the hypervisor attached method. So we choose yes. And then for storage containers, we're going to choose the container that's associated or a container that you created for that cluster. So in my case, it ends in 338, so we're going to choose that. So then it asks for the cluster domain FQDN hostname for ingress. We're just going to skip that for now. And of course, the Acme configuration, of course, for Let's Encrypt, we're going to skip that for now as well. And the certificate files, private key, etc. for ingress, we're going to skip that. So for registry, and by the way, I'm only skipping that to make this process quicker, but you would definitely fill this out, right, in a production solution, right? You would have a Let's Encrypt or a certificate management platform, and you would have a certificate file and chain and private key for your ingress as well. We provide traffic as the ingress. Again, I'll get into the open source tooling that we provide, that we lifecycle for you to make this cluster production ready. One of those is the ingress, which we use is traffic. For registry, we're going to stop here. We use Harbor, right? And I use Harbor. I talked about this earlier. And I have a Harbor URL, of course, and I have the local path. Remember, I talked about creating a registry, a certificate for authentication, for your Kubernetes clusters to leverage, and then the the registry username and password for Harbor. So in this case, it's going to be https harbor.utech.local, and my proxy cache or mirror registry, same thing, is docker.io, which you can see here, docker.io, which is my proxy cache. Okay. Now we're going to choose the path to the certificate, and in my case, I downloaded the certificate from the server, and I have it in my home directory located under home-server.crt on this jump box. We're going to use the Harbor credentials and the SSH user. If you don't put a username here, it'll automatically default to Convoy, but I'm going to use Mike. That's what I use for SSH. That's my name. That's my SSH user. And for SSH public key, the public key is where I showed you before. I may not show you on the jump box. I created a SSH public key and private key pair, and it's in the homemike.ssh _ID _rsa.pub for the public key, and that's where it is. I'm not using a proxy. There is no proxy here, so I'm going to bypass that. And then you can sit here and you have two options at the bottom here for create NKP cluster or dry run. So I suggest that you should do a dry run to make sure everything comes out okay and there's no errors that happen. It won't create the cluster, but it'll run through the process to validate everything. So I suggest you do that first. I'm not going to do that here. I'm just going to go and do the create. And here we're going to go through the create process, and now we're creating the bootstrap cluster. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open another terminal and log in. Oh my gosh, if I can type. And log in, I can't type today. And log in back to the jump box. Okay, and now we're going to do a Docker PS. So you can see here that we're creating the bootstrap cluster, and that creation of the bootstrap cluster is basically creating that Docker container for the bootstrap process. And within that Docker container, we're going to initialize the CAPI components for the Nutanix infrastructure over here. Okay, so again, you can see here that the Docker container is created. It's called Mesosphere/Convoy. It's using this image. Okay, here's the container ID. And essentially what's happening is it's going to go through and use this to actually bootstrap the NKP cluster. And as we go here on the Prism Central side under infrastructure, under VMs, you're going to start to see these VMs build out. Now, not only is it going to build the cluster, it's also going to prep the cluster based on the lowest license version. So in our case, we use NKP Starter, right, as the lowest license version. And within NKP Starter, it has specific functionality. So for example, you have the ability to use ingress, right? So it's going to install traffic. It's going to install the CAPI components. So there are specific features and functionality, right? Some open source, like traffic as an example, that will automatically be installed through the process. And as we go back here and look down to the bottom here, it's initializing the CAPI components, and then you can see here it's creating cluster class resources, right? It's creating the secrets, right, from the registry, from the Prism Central, etc., and it's creating a config map, right, for the bootstrap configuration. So you can see here that it's going through the process, right, based on the information we provided in the TUI here to actually deploy the cluster. So we're waiting for the cluster to be ready. We're looking over here to the right. Let's see if anything is spinning up here. Not yet. So nothing is spun up. So in the interest of time, what I'm going, oh, here we go. We can see one just popped in. So you can see here that the first control plane node actually has been created. And now it's actually creating these, it's going to start creating the additional control plane nodes, then deploy the worker nodes. And then what will happen is at the end of this, it'll give me a message of what to do next. So in the interest of time, I'm going to basically pause here, let it finish, and then when it's done, we'll review what was done, and then we'll log into the actual NKP interface. Okay, now that you see that everything is done here, let's just go up here and I'll show you here. So So again, it walks you through the process of what's actually happening. Create the bootstrap cluster, right? Actually, if we go back just real quick, you can see that the bootstrap cluster here, or the bootstrap container, has actually been removed because the CAPI component, right, has been moved, has been transitioned into the NKP cluster. So there's no need to have this container any longer. So initializes the new CAPI components, creates cluster class. I talked about this earlier, creating the secrets from the information we provided. Then it created the infrastructure, right, the control planes, and then it moved the new CAPI components right over to, didn't really move it, but actually initialized the CAPI solution over onto the NKP cluster. Creates cluster class, moving cluster resources, and then at that point you actually go in with your kube config file. It actually gets created, and it's in home mic SSH NKP. I'm not sure. I think I actually deployed this from the SSH directory. I probably should have deployed it from my home directory instead, but regardless, I can move that config file. And then it goes into the NKP components, right? So essentially deploying the open source stuff I was talking about before, like the open source solutions like Flux, Ingress, Git operator, Flux configuration, Commander, which is our stuff, right? Our solution, Gatekeeper, which I'll talk about here in a little while, and then some of these core applications I was talking about, right? So you have the core component, or the Commander installation, right, which is really around all of these pieces here, and then those core components, those core app deployments, which are really part of what we deliver to make your cluster production ready, right? Meaning we chose these 30 plus or so open source technologies that we deploy in lifecycle for you. Because we're deploying in a starter configuration, right? We've only deployed the core deployments, the applications that are allowed in starter, right? When we create, when we obtain a new license for Ultimate or Pro as an example, as soon as we apply the license, we'll deploy the additional core application components, right? Like MetalLB, like Grafana, right? The whole PLG stack from Prometheus, Grafana, Loki, etc. for logging, FluentBit for logging. All of these things will deploy automatically, which I'll show you after we deploy the cluster license. Before we actually go to the dashboard, you actually have to run this piece to actually get the dashboard information. I'm not going to do that in front of you because it's going to have my password information there, so I'm not going to do that. But essentially what you do is you run this command here. It's highlighted at the bottom here to the left, and from that point you'll get the information and you'll be able to log in with the URL, username, and password. What we can do is we can actually export the kube config file. Actually, you know what? Let me move this file. We're going to move this to and you can see now I moved the config file into where I wanted it. And really I should have a .cube folder within here with the config files, but I don't. So basically I'm going to export this file now. And I'm going to use this, nkp, management.conf. And now I can do a k-get nodes. And by the way, I use aliases, so if you see me say k, I actually have the alias k, right, is associated with kubectl, right? So instead of me typing out kubectl, I just use k. And you can see here I have my 3 control plane nodes and my 3 worker nodes for the NKP platform. And over here to the right, it actually matches, right, with the infrastructure that was deployed on the Nutanix platform. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to grab this login information. And now we're going to open up a web page and we're going to copy the URL. And we're going to now log into the NKP interface here. It's my user and the password it provided. Okay, and now I'm going to make this big so you guys can see it. And now I'm logged into the interface, and you can see here in the upper left hand corner here that I highlighted here is NKP starter. again, there is no license associated with this. Automatically, you start with starter, and then you have to obtain or purchase a license, right, to provide you additional features beyond starter, right? In the blog post, I talked about the different packages, and if you're a current Nutanix customer that has NCI Pro or NCI Ultimate, or any version of NCP, you have the ability to leverage starter on that cluster. Okay, so that's great. So the ability to actually spin up these Kubernetes solutions, and that may be the way you want to go. Maybe you just leverage starter, and then you decide to use your own tooling, and you only need to use our Node OS image and things like that. You have the ability to do that, but generally speaking, when I talk to customers, really they're looking at at least pro level features into ultimate level features to give you that really production ready capability out of the box. One of the beauties of NKP is not having to go and look at the CNCFI chart to determine what solutions I need to choose for my ingress, for my load balancing, for my observability stack, for my policy management, my GitOps. All of these things are provided for you, provisioned for you, and lifecycle managed for you. So they're upgraded along with NKP itself. So again, that's the beauty of the platform, giving you this production ready system. And when I apply the ultimate license and I show you the deployment of those other capabilities, at the end of that, we're going to show you what this looks like. So again, I have a global view, and you can see here I'm in the management cluster workspace. So workspaces are great. So I can take a workspace and I can add several clusters to it. I can assign different RBAC roles to the workspace. It's very, very granular. And then I can get into more granularity with projects and down to namespaces. A project could be associated with an application. So for example, you may say, okay, I want this workspace that encompasses these two clusters or this group of clusters, but this project contains this application and is associated with these clusters. So automatically, when I deploy that application, it gets deployed to all the clusters that's associated with that project in those workspaces. So again, you can have more global rollouts of your applications and more global manageability, but also give that granular capability. Here we have the commander host. This is basically the cluster that we're logged into, the cluster that we created using the TUI, and now I have access to the management cluster namespace and of course global cluster namespace. Under administration, I have infrastructure provider. So in here, I automatically created a Nutanix infrastructure provider. Remember that when we deployed using the TUI, we created a bootstrap container. I showed you that under the Docker, under Docker PS, right, to show you the running containers. At that point, it actually ran the the CAPI component for Nutanix, and then as soon as we deployed the infrastructure, we transitioned the CapEx infrastructure, or CAPI, we call it CapEx because of Nutanix, but the CAPI services onto this cluster. So now we have an infrastructure provider, and because I'm using starter, I can only use Nutanix as a provider, right, as a target to deploy Kubernetes clusters. Okay, you will need Pro or Ultimate to deploy on other substrates, right, outside of Nutanix, like public cloud, and again, even to bring in non-NKP solutions into NKP, right? Like for example, you need to bring in a GKE cluster from GCP as an example. I can't do that unless I have Ultimate. So there are some gates when it comes to features and functionality. Again, I would ask you to go back to the blog, and there's an NKP landing page link in there that you can click on to get more details on the different capabilities of the different packaging. Okay. Identity providers, we actually are going to set this up. I'm going to do this after I apply the Ultimate license. So I am going to set up an identity provider. NKP uses DEX from an OAuth perspective, and then we can point back to a SAML provider or OIDC provider, or even an LDAP provider. I'm going to use LDAP since I have my domain solution already set up, and we'll be using LDAP, and I'll show you what that looks like. We'll create a group that gives us access, but again, I'm generally an administrator of everything. I can set up different access. I'll show you what that looks like here in a little while. There are built-in cluster roles and cluster role binding. So for example, you have built-in cluster roles. You can actually create new cluster roles if you wanted, and you can bind those cluster roles into the groups that you decide. So for example, if I create a group and it's called NKP admins as an example, and I associate that with a group within LDAP, those users that fall into that LDAP group will have the cluster roles assigned to that role binding. Here's the licensing again. You see here it's automatically gives you starter. Here's some support information. Most of the functionality that you're going to have in starter is really going to be about deploying clusters using the Rocky Linux solution and some other things, right? But mostly you're going to be managing this using kubectl, right, from the CLI. So if I do k get nodes, you see the node. If I get k get pods all, you can see all of these pods. Again, we deploy MetalLB as well, part of starter from a load balancing perspective. And some other features. The CSI controllers are deployed, and of course now you have CSI access to the cluster. Now, there may be some persistent volumes already created, and here you go. So some of these features require persistent volumes, and through the CSI, through the deployment, it's able to actually call the volumes, the block storage on Nutanix HCI to deliver those volumes back to MD01. It required a persistent volume, and that was actually deployed during the deployment process we created. When I deploy an app with persistent volumes, you'll see that what happens when we do that. And it's kind of the same thing. Basically what we're doing is we're using our block storage back into volume groups to actually create persistent volume claims and persistent volumes for the applications. Some applications within the NKP stack require PVCs, and that's why you see PVCs have already been created through this process. Okay, so I'm going to stop here real quick. I'm going to grab a license and I'm going to apply the license, and then we're going to watch the cluster a little bit. So what we'll do is we'll do get pods a -- watch, okay, and you'll see what's going to happen, and you'll see how the additional capabilities that are going to be added to the cluster automatically basically when I apply the license. So we're going to add those features automatically for you on the application of the license. So there's no checkbox, or do I have to go to each feature? So if I want to add kube cost as an example, or if I want to add the PLG stack, do I have to go in and kind of check a box and deploy these applications one by one? And the answer is no. We'll do that on the application of the license, because the license allows you, right, access to those upper tier applications to give you more of a complete stack solution. So let me grab the license and I'll be right back. Okay, so I have the license, and now what we're going to do now is we're going to go into licensing, and I'm going to remove this license. And now I'm going to activate license, Nutanix license. Okay, so now you see it's NKP Ultimate, and let's watch here to the left to see what happens. I'm actually watching the live activity of the pods and see what happens here with the actual cluster itself. You're going to start seeing a lot of things happen over to the left-hand window because we're now going to be deploying all of those applications that come with, or most of them, not all of them, but majority of applications that come with the NKP Ultimate bundle as an example. Another thing that changes is the dashboard. As you can see here, it's a little bit different. And you can see here that we have a bunch of different things that are happening here. We're enabling Grafana, right? Karma as far as the Prometheus Alert Manager. So there's a lot of things that are going to start to happen here in the background. And so you can see here to the left a whole bunch of things that are happening. Things running. Kube cost is being deployed. Grafana logging being deployed as an example. Just a lot of things, a lot of applications will be deployed here. So we'll wait till this gets done. And when this is done, we'll go back to the actual dashboard and we'll review what the dashboard looks like through NKP Ultimate. All the applications that are available to you out of the box from a core app perspective to get you production ready for Kubernetes. And you can see here it's a fairly straightforward process. And we'll be up and running here in a few minutes. Again, full production stack, ready to go, ready to deploy application clusters. This is the beauty of NKP, how fast you can actually deploy this and get up and running to a production ready platform. Okay, so we were just waiting for the last deployment to finish, and it looks like it's done. And you can see here a lot of things have been deployed when we applied the Ultimate licensing, to include like Valero backup, Grafana Loki, So a whole bunch of things, and we're going to go back to the dashboard. So let's maximize the dashboard. Just going to refresh it, and you can see here it's changed quite a bit here from what you saw from the starter version. There's a whole bunch of things that we can do here, and we can see here there's a bunch of different things like clusters now, workspaces, and things like that. Let's go back to the cluster real quick, view the details on the cluster, and this is going to give us access to the applications that have been deployed right during the post license application. So you can see Grafana logging, Loki, logging operator, Rooksuff, Ceph cluster, Prometheus, Kubernetes dashboard, KubeCost was deployed, Prometheus, Gatekeeper, right, for policy management, Valero backup, NKP AI Navigator, which we'll talk about here. It's over to the right-hand side here. You can see here it's a GPT-powered AI Navigator. We'll talk about that here a little bit later. And then we have Reloader and Traffic Ingress, right? So a whole bunch of things have been deployed, right? And we can actually go to these things by clicking on the application dashboard. So if I want to look at Grafana, I can go under Grafana, and you can see here I have a whole bunch of dashboards that are already pre-created for me, which is actually great, right? So here's some dashboards here, but if I want to get additional dashboards, I can go down here. So let's look at, as an example, persistent volumes. I can click that and go into that and look at usage for persistent volumes, what persistent volumes are in this namespace. So if I want to change this to Commander, here's a different persistent volume, maybe Grafana, distributed ingester, what's this persistent volume. So again, there's a bunch of dashboards already pre-created. You can customize your own dashboards, but of course, let's look at traffic as an example, right? So you can see traffic, response time, requests, etc. So again, all these dashboards are there for your use. There's also logging. So if I want to go into the Grafana logging, let's go here to logging dashboard via Loki, right? And we can do data source Loki, and let's look at Cilium or Cilium operator, right? So here we have some logs here, right? And again, you can see a whole bunch of these things already being pre-created for you, which is really, really useful information. There's also KubeCost, so we can go to the dashboard here and look at cost modeling, right? Now, one thing this doesn't do is it doesn't include the license, right, to get you the full view of KubeCost. It does not. What it does is it deploys KubeCost and then Lifecycle manages that for you, but you still need to get the license and apply a license to KubeCost. We're not providing that out of the box because it's an open source solution, actually owned by IBM now, but it's a solution that IBM will provide, or through an open source model, but you still have to get a license, and we don't provide that for you. Then of course Prometheus, you can look at that. Let's go to Prometheus, and you can do some alerts. You can look at alerts. Let's see, look at this watchdog alert. So again, we're giving you all this access out of the box, ready to go after I applied the license. It's that quick. And then of course the default traffic dashboard, right? I like the dark theme and everything, so we have the default traffic dashboard, and you can see your services, your middleware, your routers, TCP, UDP, etc. Okay, so now that we've kind of seen what we're getting with the application or the upgrade to NKP Ultimate, let's go ahead and do a couple things that are extremely important. Of course, I want to get into access control. And you can see here, I know we had 2 roles last time. There's a whole bunch of new roles created. We definitely need to provide identity provider, etc., to get RBAC working in the solution. So what we're going to do is you can say, go through this get started. To get started with the management workspace, let's go. We can go to access control, or you can create a role, cluster role binding, create groups, etc. But we're in the management workspace. So what we want to do is get into the global workspace, hit get started, and we're going to hit let's go, add an identity provider. So you can see here that you have 4 identity providers automatically ready to go out of the box. One is GitHub, LDAP, OIDC, and of course SAML authentication. I know a lot of people use SAML, but in my case we're going to use LDAP. And we're going to use all workspaces for this identity provider. And I'm actually going to use my domain called utech.local. This is my host. Okay, my actual domain server is 10.0.10.10 on port 389, of course. You don't need to put LDAP colon // it automatically fills it in for you. Make sure you look at what you need to put in here. Remember, it's host and port, not the LDAP, not like this, right? Which some people, some other solutions require you to do. You don't need to do that here. The bind DN is your service account. You really should have a read-only service account for this. And I mean read-only, read-only domain objects, right? Versus a admin account. I created a NKP service account. This is the DN distinguished name for this service account, and that's what you'll use. The bind password here, I'm going to input that. I'm going to go in secure, and I'm going to skip the TLS verification. And now we need a user-based distinguished name. So really that's CN users DC UTech. And this is my domain here, right? And my users, I'm going to use a user search base. User search name is the SAM account name. All right, so that's what you'll use. And you'll skip search filter. And we'll go to search attribute is distinguished name. Search email is the user principal name. Search name is the name. And search suffix will leave blank. So in here we're going to go to group queries. And group queries are going to be CN users, DC utech.local. Group search filter is going to be object class equals group, right? So you can see here that it's in this format. Make sure that your formatting is properly set up. And the group name attribute is going to be CN. And we're going to add a group search attribute member. And this will be DN. Okay? So now we'll hit save. So what we did here is we just added an identity provider. Have to set up access control. So the identity provider is done, and I'm going to configure access control. So what we need to do is we need to, I'm not going to create a role for now. You can create a role, but I'm going to use a couple default roles. I'm going to do a cluster role binding. So I'm going to choose NKP admins as my group, and I'm going to add the OIDC NKP admin. Let me make sure that's right here. So let me go to let me RDP into my server real quick. CN as NKP admins. And remember, you have to do it in this fashion. It'll tell you that. So if I got rid of this and hit add group, it will tell you to actually put it in like that. Make sure you prefix the group name with OIDC. So we're going to save that. Now we're going to add roles, and I'm going to use the cluster admin role and the DKP commander admin role. So hit save. Okay, now in NKP admins, my domain account, which is msheehy, is part of the NKP admin group, the NKP admins group within the domain. So I'm using the NKP service account as a read-only account to query the domain and issue the authentication, right, to use that as an authentication method back to NKP. So let me just make sure I'm good. NKP admins. Now I should be able to log out, log back in. So let's log in with my domain account. You don't have to use a fully qualified domain. Okay, now you see that I'm logged in, upper right hand corner, display name is shown, etc. So this account is basically the same account as a super admin. So I have cluster admin access and NKP admin access throughout the whole solution. So again, I'll stay here logged in under this account. We'll move on to the next part of the demo, but you get the idea, right? You can create a whole bunch of different groups and assign roles or create custom roles for clusters, projects, workspaces, etc. So speaking of that, that's the next thing we're actually going to get into now. So let's create a workspace. Out of the box, you get the management cluster workspace, global, management, and default. We're going to stay away from these for now. Let's go to create a workspace, and we'll call this app demo. So this is the application demo workspace. And it's going to automatically use these key value pairs from a annotation perspective. And if you wanted to add labels, custom labels, you could do that, or annotations. You could do that. So I'm just going to hit create for now. And we'll continue to workspace. The access control is a global thing. We could have done that per workspace, but I made it globally. So we'll keep it global. But what you'll notice here is that the infrastructure provider is missing for this workspace app demo, right? So if we go here, we're going to add an infrastructure provider, and you can see all the providers that we can add. So what we'll do is we'll add Nutanix and we'll add AWS, and I'll show you how that works. But essentially, what we're doing here is we're adding the Prism Central endpoint and the login or the username and password used to authenticate against Prism Central with the permissions. And we're not going to have a trust bundle, so this is going to be untrusted, right? And they'll tell you, right, without certificate validation, we're going to continue anyway. So you can see here now that we have an infrastructure provider for this workspace of app demo of Nutanix, and I can now deploy clusters at will within this within the Nutanix infrastructure provider. So I'll add another infrastructure provider, we'll call it AWS, and now I have a AWS. Okay, so now that we have our two infrastructure providers set up in the app demo workspace, now I can actually deploy clusters here into AWS or into Nutanix. So you can see here, if I go back to clusters and I add a cluster, I can either create a cluster through NKP, I can upload a YAML, right, configuration for a cluster, or I can attach a cluster as well. Let's go to create, and let's just pick AWS demo. We'll select AWS. You can see here I have the option to go on native AWS infrastructure like EC2 and EBS and choose my machine types, etc., or I can use a managed service or EKS, and of course use my machine types for that as well. I'm not going to do that right now. We're going to focus more on Nutanix still, so let's go cancel this. And now what we're going to do is we're actually going to deploy a new cluster for applications. Configure my control plane. Remember NKP project? Very similar to how we did the TUI, but this is now we're in the GUI now. But it's very similar things you have to set up here, right? So the project name, the cluster, the subnet, the OS image, we're choosing Ubuntu, or excuse me, we're choosing Rocky. The control plane, right? The API endpoint for Kubernetes for this cluster. So in this particular cluster, we're going to choose 215. We're going to do 3 nodes for control plane. We're going to choose worker node auto scaling, so I'm going to choose 2 and maximum to 4. And I'm going to select my container. I'll keep my reclaim policy, delete my file system default. I'm going to change my pod networking again. And I'm going to put my load balancing addresses in. And I'm going to use the image registry mirror. I'm going to upload the certificate. So now we're creating a cluster in the app demo workspace. And I'm going to actually create one cluster. We'll deploy an application, and then we'll end the video for now. But this is because this is a long one. And then next week we'll deploy another cluster. We'll set up disaster recovery, and then we'll focus on more advanced capabilities with some of the applications. Right, backup. We'll introduce files database as a service into the mix, and the rest of the segments as we move through the NKP demos here. So this is going to take a little while, but you can view details here. So we'll click that, and you can see here that's provisioning. And if we go back to the Nutanix console, which unfortunately logged me out here, we'll go to infrastructure, and we'll look and see if any of the VMs have been, and you can see here we're already creating the nodes, right? Here's the control plane node, the first one, for our app demo PRD cluster here. So again, I'll be back in a couple minutes, and we'll wait till this is done here. Okay, now we see that the cluster is created, the app demo prod cluster. And one thing I wanted to note just real quick is the status will show active pretty quickly because it'll deploy fairly quickly on your infrastructure. You can see here the 3 nodes for control plane, the 2 worker nodes. I have auto scaling on, so between 2 and 4 nodes are turned on. So when you need additional node capacity, the cluster will automatically scale up to 4 nodes. And that's a setting that you saw me deploy within the deployment walkthrough, right, for this cluster. But one thing I want to just talk about here is it will show active, but it won't be ready. And this is where I think there could be a little bit of disconnect, and of course I'll be talking to the NKP folks about this. But what happens is the cluster is ready from a Kubernetes perspective, but the supporting applications may not be ready. So when you go in here, it just says active. You might see that some of these applications are still trying to be, or going through an enablement or an installation process. So please wait until all these installations are done. That way you have the complete, full cluster ready to go with PLG, Grafana, etc. Your cluster is ready for production, right? Because you want to have these things enabled during that process. Now again, we're in the app demo workspace under these clusters, right? You can see the applications here. There's 8 enabled applications, and you can certainly look at the disabled applications as well and enable those applications as well, okay? So if you want to add Valero as an example for backup in this cluster, we certainly can do that. We're going to do that later in the backup section. We're not going to do that right now, but really what we're going to focus on is looking at the cluster like you would look at any other cluster through kubectl. So what we do here is we go to clusters, and we go to view details under the cluster, and now we can download the kubeconfig file. So you can see here I have a kubeconfig file on my local machine, and what I need to do is I need to actually move this file to my jump box. So I'm on my machine here under WSL on my Ubuntu machine for WSL and Windows, and here's my jump box. So what we're going to do here is we're actually going to SCP this config file over to my jump box, which I just done. And now we're going to look and see that file is there, and you can see here that the kubeconfig file is there for the app demo. And now we're going to export, right, this file as well as the NKP-management. That way we have the ability to change cluster context. So if I do a kubectl, remember K is the alias for kubectl, kconfig get context. You can see now I have 2 different contexts or 2 different clusters I can access. So you can see here the current one is the NKP management cluster that we built in the beginning, but now I want to go to the app demo cluster because we're going to start deploying some applications here. So what we're going to do here is we're actually going to set the context. So we're going to do a kconfig use context, and we're going to use the app demo PRD context. And now if we do a k get nodes oy, you can see here now I'm in the app demo cluster that we just built. Right here are the 2 worker nodes, and here are the 3 control plane nodes. Now if we do a k get pods -all, you can see here again the Nutanix CSI driver is already installed, so we have access to block storage off the bat. We don't have access to file storage yet. That's something that we're going to cover in more of the advanced data services. So if you have applications that require read-write many access, right, for via CSI, you'll need to use a file solution. So we have files. Again, that's part of the Nutanix full stack and comes with the solution. And for that, we'll have to set up the CSI for files, as well as the storage, storage for files, etc. That we, in order to deliver either static or dynamic PVCs, more than likely we'll be delivering dynamic PVC. That's what we want to do. We want to have the system to actually create the persistent volumes for you instead of you going in making a static, persistent volume every single time. That's not something that anybody wants to do. They want it to be more dynamic. So we'll talk about that later, but you can see here we have, again, CSI, we have our load balancing set up, right? We have our snapshot controller for the CSI for block, right? So if you want to do snapshots on block, you can do that as well. We have our scheduler, our proxy, right? All the Kubernetes solutions, of course, etcd, right? From a key value pair for the cluster configuration, the API server, and we use Cilium for CNI for Nutanix HV, right? So this is one of the things that I'm really excited about as we start moving to more advanced feature capability with Cilium, and Cilium being this one-stop shop for all of your networking functionality. I mean, you're getting service mesh-like features, they have load balancing, all of these things. Some of these things aren't supported on Nutanix NKP yet, but those are also coming in the roadmap, like egress and things like that. You have Cert Manager, of course, we install that, traffic for ingress, and here's your Prometheus, right, for your database, right, for your telemetry. And then, of course, you have your KubeCost, right, Grafana, right, all of these things, Alert Manager, all the things that you expect to have in a production-ready solution. And if you want to add more applications, you can come down here, right, and you can look at the applications, and you can install the application. So if you want to go into applications, you go to applications, and you can see what's enabled and what's disabled. So for example, if you want to enable Valero for backup, you can certainly do that, right, and deploy Valero automatically. Or if you want to enable external DNS, you can do that. Or NKP Insights as an example. And we'll talk about Insights here in a little bit from an operations perspective. I'm going to have a whole series on how this, how NKP really provides simplified operations from a day two perspective as well. And we're going to get into that, I believe, in the next blog post and video. So in the interest of time, I know this is going to be a long one, let's deploy an application that requires persistent storage, right? It has a couple services, a structured database, right, for persistence, all of those things that you would expect in a modern application. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to go back to kubectl here, and we're going to cd into projects, cd into apps, and cd into Nextcloud. So you can see here that there's all these YAML files, right, that I've created to deploy Nextcloud. And so what is Nextcloud? So Nextcloud is like a on-prem or a premises-based cloud solution for file storage, managing projects, pictures. There's even other capabilities like, for example, chat, telephony, things like that. Okay. Now I know this isn't necessarily an enterprise app, but if you look at it, and by the way, what I've done is I've combined all of these YAML files, right, from the deployment of the databases, right, to the Nextcloud deployment, to the service, right, to the creation of the PVCs, and I've made one YAML file, right, specification for that. So we're going to open that. So we'll go back to CD, and we're going to VI into the Nextcloud YAML. And you can see here as I open this up here what we have here. So the first thing we're doing is we're going to create the persistent volume claim for Nextcloud. That actually is the persistent volume for the file storage. Then we create the deployment for Nextcloud, right? So this is your Nextcloud and your mount path. Then we create the service. We're going to be using the type load balancer, so we'll be using MetalLB for the load balancer. Then we're going to create the PVC for the database, right? And we're using MySQL, so we're going to deploy MySQL with a configuration. Of course, some of these things I wouldn't use, like the secrets, right? We have the password, right, etc. Those would be secret. So I would have it, in a real production solution, it wouldn't look like that. Then we deploy, obviously, the backend service for the database connectivity as well. So let's get out of here. We're going to quit out of here, and we're going to do a kubectl apply-f nextcloud and something kube apply-f nextcloud.yaml. And we see here that the Nextcloud namespace was not created. It's one thing I haven't done yet. Remember, this is a new cluster, so what we're going to do here is we're now going to create the namespace. So let's do a kube create namespace nextcloud-nqxrg. Okay, so now if we do kubectl get namespace, we can see here that there is the Nextcloud nqxrg namespace. And what we'll do here is now we're going to apply the application. So do k get all we can see here now we have a container creating, right, for the pods. We have the services created. The deployments are moving forward, and we have the replica sets moving forward here. Let's check the PVCs here. So let's do a k get PVC dash namespace nextcloud nqxrg, and you can see the two PVCs have been created. So let's go back and make sure that those PVCs have been created. We go into Vime groups, PVCs. And I won't go through all of these, but essentially these PVCs were created. They're actually in here now. And let's go back to see if we have everything up. And you can see here now we have the pods running, right, for the database and for Nextcloud, as well as the service. And you can see here the IP address that was provided through MetalLB was 10.0.10.217. So if I hit this IP address, we're forwarding to port 80, right? So what we're going to do is go to this IP address and see if Nextcloud is actually running. And you can see here that Nextcloud is running. So let's do some, I think it's admin. So what we'll do to configure this is actually go in and we'll actually configure it. So again, this is just a demo. I'm not going to configure this because we're going to use this application for the backup, and we're also going to use this application for the DR. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to configure it later during that time. But essentially what I've done is now showing you this application. And now if we go into here, into the actual cluster, and we go into Grafana, I may have been kicked out here. Let's see. So now we're in Grafana. Let's go to dashboards. And what we'd have to do is we'd have to create a dashboard for that specific namespace here. Let's see if I can find something that will look like this though. And so there's no data coming in yet, right? It's fairly new, so, but you can see here that the utilization is already coming in. No data for CPU, so this hasn't been updated yet. Let's see. But you can see here what what Nextcloud is using from a memory perspective, from a database, and from a app perspective, CPU and memory utilization, and the current networking utilization. Okay, so now we have full visibility into our app, right, from a telemetry perspective. And of course, if we wanted to get logs, we can just go back here. Oh, logging is disabled, so I would have to enable this as a platform application within this app cluster. This is one of the ones that has not been enabled. Let's take a look and see how to do that, though. Let's go in here. Go to applications. We'll hit enable on this cluster. You need rookstuff installed. So it's telling you exactly what the dependencies are. So one of the things that we use is rookstuff. So we'd actually have to deploy rookstuff cluster, rookstuff, and then you could install Grafana Loki to actually get the logging and the logging operator. So you need to have all these kind of things here enabled across the board and deployed in order for this to actually work properly. So I'm not going to do that now, but essentially we now have a working cluster running the application, right? And of course you can see all this within the Kubernetes layer from a kubectl perspective, but also in the dashboard itself. So if I go to clusters, right, you can see here I have under namespaces, I can go under Nextcloud, and I can go into the Kubernetes dashboard as well to get a more detailed view of what the application is leveraging, what services, PVCs. Here are the PVCs that this application is actually leveraging, right? So fairly simple. So again, hope this was a good start to the view of Nutanix Kubernetes platform, and I hope you enjoyed it. I look forward to continuing the series and advancing more use cases, more capabilities, more features, so you can see the true power of NKP. But this is a great start, and I think we'll stop here. So I hope you have a great week ahead, and I look forward to delivering the next series.